I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Princess Anne had endured funerals, family scandals, constitutional storms, and decades of royal pressure without allowing the world to see her break. But inside a sealed room at Windsor, one small jewel destroyed that discipline in seconds. King Charles opened a dark velvet case, revealing Queen Elizabeth's long-missing Alexandrite brooch. Anne stared at it, covered her mouth, and began to cry. Because Charles had not simply found a jewel, he had recovered a piece of their mother. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne could not look away. She remembered that violet-green stone from quiet family gatherings at Windsor and private evenings at Balmoral, moments that belonged to memory rather than ceremony. The crown jewels, the historic regalia and ceremonial treasures held for the monarchy, were different. This brooch had always felt personal. Charles knew that distinction was why the room had suddenly become so heavy. Charles had personally recovered the brooch from Camilla's possession and returned it to Queen Elizabeth's private family collection. He set the case down and watched his sister recognize it before the lid was fully open. Anne's shoulders tightened, her eyes filled. "I thought it was gone," she whispered, and the king heard grief beneath the relief. Charles had watched Anne survive loss without surrendering control, which made her tears harder to bear. He closed the door so no aid could enter. Anne reached toward the case, then stopped before touching it. For the king, that hesitation changed everything. This was no longer about protocol or storage. It was about their mother, and whether her private wishes had been respected after death. The discovery had begun with a quiet inventory review. An inventory review is a formal check of recorded possessions against what is actually held, and this one exposed a discrepancy between Elizabeth's handwritten personal list and the official catalogue prepared after her reign. Charles showed Anne two entries. One placed the brooch among family pieces. Another made it appear available for wider royal use. Then the most disturbing detail emerged. The storage record attached to the case appeared to have been changed after Elizabeth died. Someone had moved the jewel on paper before it ever moved in reality. Anne looked directly at Charles. Her grief hardened into suspicion. "Who changed it?" she asked. Then came the harder question. And did Camilla know? Charles did not answer immediately. The silence between them suddenly sharpened. But once Anne asked how their mother's jewel had crossed into Camilla's hands, the king understood that recovering the brooch may have been the easiest part of what came next. The Alexandrite brooch means something different to every person trapped inside this royal conflict. To Anne, it is memory. To Charles, it is responsibility. To Camilla, it has become an accusation she cannot simply place back inside a box. And to William, watching from the edge of the family dispute, it is proof that private possessions can become emotional weapons when grief, authority, and trust collide behind palace doors. Anne remembers the brooch long before it became the center of suspicion. She remembers Queen Elizabeth wearing it during private family evenings, including one Balmoral dinner when there were no cameras, no grand ceremony, and no public performance. Balmoral is the royal family's Scottish residence, often associated with quieter family time away from formal palace life. That memory matters, because Anne never saw the jewel as part of an official display. She saw it as something tied directly to her mother. Charles feels the pressure from another direction. As monarch, he must separate possessions connected to the crown from items Elizabeth intended to remain personal. The crown, in this context, means the institution of monarchy rather than one individual person. Yet he is also her eldest son, and that makes every decision more painful. Anne tells him that their mother was careful with sentimental belongings because she understood that small objects could carry enormous memories for her children. The thought that those wishes may have been reduced to paperwork leaves her deeply wounded. Camilla feels the accusation closing around her. She believes the family has begun judging her before anyone has established exactly how the brooch reached her collection. She tells Charles privately that she never wanted to appear as though she had taken something that belonged to Elizabeth's children. The Queen Consort is angry, but underneath that anger is humiliation. Charles hears both emotions, and he knows simply returning the jewel will not repair the damage. William then notices something everyone else has missed. He studies the amended inventory notation and compares it with older records prepared by Elizabeth's longtime household staff. An inventory notation is simply the written record describing where an item belongs and how it may be used. The wording feels wrong. The format is different. Even the spacing does not match. William places 2 sheets beside each other and calls Anne closer. She runs one finger beneath the altered line, while the prince explains that the new wording appears to have been inserted after the original record was completed. Charles stares at the pages without speaking. That changes everything. Someone may have transformed a private family keepsake into an item available for royal use after Elizabeth's death. Now Charles faces a darker question. Did Camilla ask for the brooch herself, or did someone deliberately place it within her reach, knowing exactly what the discovery might do to the family? The paper trail points backward toward one private gathering months earlier, the night when Anne first saw the jewel on Camilla and realized a line had already been crossed. Every royal rupture has a moment that seems insignificant, until history circles back to it. In this story, that moment came during a private Balmoral dinner, when Camilla wore an unfamiliar violet-green stone beneath the soft lights of the drawing room. Anne noticed it immediately. She did not confront her. Charles did not understand her silence. But before the evening ended, one quiet exchange beside the fireplace planted the suspicion that would eventually explode inside Windsor. Anne had arrived expecting nothing more than a private family evening months before the brooch was recovered. Balmoral, the royal family's Scottish residence, used for quieter stays away from official palace life, usually offered a different rhythm from London. Only close relatives and a small number of trusted household staff were present. That mattered because the gathering was personal, not ceremonial. When Camilla appeared wearing the shifting purple-green stone, Anne felt an old memory move sharply into focus. Anne recognized the Alexandrite almost immediately. She had seen Queen Elizabeth wear that same piece during intimate family occasions, and the memory was too specific to dismiss. Still, she told herself there had to be an explanation. Charles noticed her attention drifting and later asked what was wrong. The princess quietly asked whether he knew Camilla had access to their mother's personal jewelry. He looked genuinely surprised and said he believed the brooch had come from an approved royal selection. Charles tried to calm the situation before it became something larger. He told his sister not to turn an uncertain memory into a confrontation without proof. Anne heard caution, but it felt like dismissal. She withdrew from the conversation, yet the question would not leave her. If Elizabeth had treated the brooch as personal, how had it suddenly become available to someone else? Then came the moment nobody could undo. After dinner, Anne approached Camilla directly and asked where the brooch had come from. The Queen Consort answered calmly that it had been made available through the household collection. A household collection is the group of items managed by royal staff for approved use, rather than possessions automatically belonging to one individual. Anne knew instantly that the phrase did not fit what she remembered of Elizabeth's treatment of that jewel. Anne said little more that night, but the suspicion hardened. The next morning, she contacted an elderly former dresser who had worked closely with Elizabeth's private jewelry. In a documented private conversation, the woman became uncomfortable when the brooch was mentioned. She said clearly that the piece had never been intended for routine circulation. That was the trigger. Anne's private concern eventually reached Charles, and the king authorized the inventory review that exposed the altered record. Months later, With the recovered jewel finally sitting between them at Windsor, Charles could no longer postpone the confrontation Anne had wanted from the very beginning. Charles does not summon a committee. He does not hide behind secretaries, protocol officers, or carefully written notes. He asks Camilla to meet him privately. When she enters, the Alexandrite brooch is already lying on the table between two empty chairs. Charles remains standing. Camilla looks at the jewel, then at her husband, and understands, before a single accusation is spoken, that this conversation is unlike any disagreement they have faced before. Charles chose Windsor because he wanted the monarchy kept outside the door for as long as possible. This had to begin as a family argument, not an institutional battle. The original inventory, the official record identifying where an item belongs, listed the brooch among Queen Elizabeth's personal sentimental pieces. A later notation had widened its use, but the wording did not match the earlier record. The king tells Camilla that this difference is no longer something he can ignore. Camilla stiffens almost immediately. She insists she did not remove the brooch from Elizabeth's belongings, and never asked anyone to take it from a private collection. The queen consort feels accused before the evidence is complete, and that wounds her deeply. Charles listens, but then asks the question that breaks through her defense. Did she ever wonder why such a personal jewel had suddenly become available to her? Charles then tells her about Anne. He explains that his sister cried when the brooch was returned, something he had almost never seen from her. Camilla's anger weakens. She lowers her eyes because the dispute has suddenly changed shape. This is no longer about catalogs, palace procedure, or whether the correct form was signed. It is about Elizabeth's daughter seeing part of her mother's private life pass into somebody else's hands. Camilla finally explains how the jewel reached her. In a private recorded conversation with Charles, she says the brooch first appeared among a selection of pieces presented after the accession. The accession is the moment a new monarch formally succeeds to the throne after the previous sovereign dies. She was told the piece had already been cleared for use, and she says she accepted that assurance, without questioning the history behind it. Charles gently pushes the velvet case toward her. "Did you know this was my mother's private piece?" he asks. Camilla does not touch it. Silence stretches between them before she answers, "No." Charles presses further. "Who told her it was cleared?" Camilla names a senior household official who had supervised part of the jewelry transition after Elizabeth's death. That name changes the direction of the entire crisis. The king realizes Camilla's judgment may only be one part of the story. Someone with access to the records may have altered the trail before the brooch ever reached her. And with that single answer, Charles's anger begins moving away from the woman opposite him and toward the unseen hand behind the paperwork. The palace machinery now begins to move, but Charles refuses to let bureaucracy bury the emotional truth. A single altered entry has already divided his family. He wants names, dates, and authority. When a sealed administrative folder is placed before him the next morning, he opens it alone. Halfway through the contents, his expression changes. The document does not merely explain how the brooch moved. It reveals that someone exercised authority they may never have possessed in the first place. Charles orders a narrow internal review, focused only on Queen Elizabeth's private jewelry records, transfer notes, and the officials permitted to alter them after the accession. An internal review is a controlled palace examination of documents and decisions, designed to establish what happened without immediately turning the matter into a public scandal. The distinction matters because institutional jewelry belongs to the working structure of monarchy, while privately designated family pieces carry personal ownership, memory, and specific wishes. Charles reads every page himself. The king feels a growing sense of responsibility because the discrepancy existed under his reign and escaped notice until Anne challenged it. He removes his glasses, sets them beside the folder, and sits without speaking. For him, the failure is suddenly personal. His mother had trusted her family to understand the difference between what belonged to the institution and what belonged to memory. Anne refuses to treat the discovery as a victory. In a private documented conversation with William, she tells him that recovering the brooch cannot erase what nearly happened. Elizabeth's wishes had come dangerously close to being swallowed by routine administration. William agrees, and the prince reminds her that once a false classification becomes accepted practice, it can quietly rewrite the meaning of an object for years. Then the review exposes the first hard clue. Beside the altered entry sits an authorization, initial belonging to the senior official responsible for part of the jewelry transition. Charles studies the notation carefully. The problem is immediate. That official did not have sole authority to redesignate one of Elizabeth's privately listed possessions. A second document makes the situation even more explosive. It shows that Camilla's office received the brooch only after the altered classification had already been entered. The queen consort may have worn the jewel without knowing the record behind it had been changed. Charles now understands that suspicion has moved away from simple possession and toward the person who changed the paperwork first. Charles reads the authorization twice, draws a firm line beneath the date with his fountain pen, and presses the bell for his private secretary. His instruction is short. The responsible official is to be brought to Windsor. Now the king faces a brutal choice: protect palace stability, or expose the decision that wounded his family. By nightfall, the brooch is safe, but the person who changed its fate is walking toward a closed Windsor door. The first real consequence does not fall on Anne, Camilla, or even Charles. It falls on the official, whose decision allowed Elizabeth's brooch to drift from private memory into royal circulation. Inside Windsor, Charles listens as the explanation becomes weaker with every sentence. Outside that room, Camilla sits alone, aware that an administrative decision may clear her of deliberate theft, but cannot erase the pain caused by wearing something Anne believed should never have left her mother's private collection. Charles hears the official describe the months after Queen Elizabeth's death as confused and overloaded. Lists overlapped. Private possessions sat beside official holdings, while some pieces waited for final classification. A classification is simply the formal decision about where an item belongs and who may use it. The official argues that the brooch was redesignated to make the process easier and insists there was no clear legal restriction stopping broader royal use. But the explanation only makes the king colder. Charles does not raise his voice. He does not need to. The monarch tells the official that Elizabeth's personal wishes were not administrative clutter to be cleaned up because paperwork had become difficult. His anger is controlled, but sharp. The official tries again, saying the choice was meant to prevent delays. The king hears something else entirely. Convenience had been placed above memory. Camilla receives the next update privately. A documented account from her office confirms that the altered record existed before she ever requested permission to wear the brooch. The queen consort should feel relieved, but she does not. Anne still cried. The jewel still crossed a boundary. And Camilla understands that being cleared of deliberately engineering the transfer cannot undo the emotional damage caused when she wore it. Then the official makes the admission Charles had been waiting for. There had been uncertainty about the brooch from the beginning. The official knew the records were not entirely clear, but chose not to consult Anne or the king, because doing so could delay the post-accession jewelry review. That review was the process of sorting royal possessions after the new reign began. Charles now knows the decision was not simply mistaken. It was made despite doubt. Charles acts immediately. He removes the official from all responsibility for private royal jewelry records and orders every disputed personal item connected to Elizabeth to be checked again. No shortcut will be accepted a second time. The official leaves. Charles remains behind in silence. Across Windsor, Camilla removes the brooch pin she had planned to wear that day and places it inside a drawer. She knows the investigation has changed the facts, but not the feeling between her and Anne. Records can be corrected, officials can be removed. But the wound between those two women can only be faced when there is no paperwork left between them. No secretary writes minutes. No advisor waits outside with talking points. Anne and Camilla sit alone for the first time since the brooch was recovered, with neither Charles nor William present to soften what must be said. Anne enters, carrying no papers. Camilla brings no defense. For several seconds, neither woman speaks. Then Camilla says the one thing Anne had never expected to hear. If she had understood what the brooch meant, she would never have worn it. Anne had insisted the brooch itself stay out of the room. She did not want the conversation to become another argument over possession, records, or who had the stronger claim. Charles had arranged the meeting but stayed away, because even a sovereign, the reigning monarch who holds the crown, cannot order two people to trust each other again. This had to happen without authority pressing down on either woman. Anne speaks first about Balmoral. She tells Camilla that seeing the jewel there felt like watching something private from Queen Elizabeth's life become ceremonial decoration. The princess explains that her anger was never only about a stone. It was about memory. She had watched her mother wear that brooch in family moments untouched by official duty, and seeing it suddenly appear elsewhere felt like losing control of that memory all over again. Camilla does not interrupt. When Anne finishes, the queen consort explains that she had been told through the jewelry office that the piece was legitimately cleared for use. She says the approval came through documented household channels, and she trusted that process. But then her voice changes. Camilla admits that once she saw Anne's reaction at Balmoral, she should have asked harder questions, instead of assuming the paperwork settled everything. Camilla then reveals something Anne did not know. In a private recorded conversation from the weeks after Balmoral, she had instructed her dresser not to offer the Alexandrite brooch again. She had stopped wearing it because Anne's expression that night had stayed with her. The queen consort had never said so openly, but the discomfort had followed her long before the investigation began. Anne absorbs that quietly. She does not offer instant forgiveness, and Camilla does not ask for it. But the princess accepts one crucial fact. The altered record was created before the jewel reached Camilla, and she did not personally change it. "I should have asked," Camilla says. Anne looks down before answering. "Yes, you should have." The tension remains, but the accusation has changed shape. Anne makes one final request. Elizabeth's brooch must never become a trophy, proving that one woman defeated another. Charles must decide where it belongs permanently. Their conversation removes one layer of blame, leaving the king with the final responsibility only he can carry, deciding what becomes of his mother's jewel. By the time the palace confirms that Queen Elizabeth's Alexandrite brooch has been restored to her private family collection, the story has escaped the walls of Windsor. Headlines race ahead of explanation. Commentators argue over inheritance, loyalty, and royal memory. Then one photograph changes the mood entirely. Anne is seen leaving St. George's Chapel after a private service, her face composed but visibly emotional, while Charles walks several steps behind her, carrying the small velvet case. Charles authorizes a carefully restrained palace statement. It confirms that one item from Elizabeth's personal jewelry inventory had been incorrectly classified during the post-accession transition, and has now been restored to its proper place. The post-accession transition is the period after a new monarch takes the throne, when official responsibilities, records, and possessions are reorganized. That detail matters, because the statement also makes clear that the mistake existed before the brooch entered Camilla's approved selection. Anne hates what follows. She tells Charles privately that she does not want her mother's memory turned into a public contest with winners and losers. The princess knows the brooch means more than palace embarrassment. It carries memories of Balmoral, family dinners, and the private side of Elizabeth that the public never fully knew. Charles understands, but the king also knows silence would allow suspicion to grow even faster. Camilla feels that suspicion immediately. The queen consort knows the statement reduces the blame against her, but it cannot erase the image people already remember of her wearing the jewel. In a documented private conversation with her household, she admits that some observers will never read the correction. They will remember the brooch first and the altered paperwork second. That realization leaves her frustrated, but also resigned. Then one front page changes the emotional tone. A fictional national newspaper leads with Anne leaving St. George's Chapel with red-rimmed eyes, while Charles follows carrying the closed velvet case. The headline is restrained, focusing simply on Elizabeth's recovered family jewel. The image does what arguments could not. It makes the story feel less like scandal and more like grief. A national broadcaster pushes the story further, focusing on Charles's decision to audit other personal items connected to his mother. An audit is a detailed check of records and possessions to make sure they match. Suddenly, the crisis becomes larger than one brooch. It becomes a question of whether Elizabeth's private wishes were fully protected after her death. Outside Windsor Castle, a small crowd falls strangely quiet as Anne's car passes. Phones lower. Nobody cheers. That evening, Charles invites Anne and William back to Windsor. The king has decided where the brooch will remain, and why nobody will wear it anytime soon. When the palace gates close, the public argument fades away, leaving one final family decision waiting inside. The story ends not with punishment, triumph, or another royal humiliation, but with a small velvet case resting where Charles believes it should have remained all along. Anne stands beside him. William watches quietly. The brooch that triggered anger, suspicion, tears, and confrontation is no longer being treated as an accessory or a symbol of victory. It is being returned to what Elizabeth intended it to represent: family memory, protected from ambition, misunderstanding, and palace machinery. Charles formally restores the Alexandrite brooch to Queen Elizabeth's designated private family collection. That collection means the group of personal possessions kept for family significance, rather than routine royal use. The king orders the new record to state its status so clearly that no future wardrobe office can transfer it by mistake. He also directs that the late queen's remaining sentimental jewelry be checked against her original personal records, making sure no other family piece has been quietly reclassified. Anne finally takes the brooch into her hands. The princess remembers her mother fastening it before a Balmoral dinner many years earlier, and the memory hits harder than she expects. Tears return, but they are different now. There is no anger in them. There is relief. William remains close, and the prince says nothing, because he understands that this moment belongs first to his aunt and her brother. Charles then gives Anne something she has needed since the beginning: an apology. He admits that when she first raised her concern at Balmoral, he tried too hard to keep peace. The monarch believed caution would prevent a family argument, but instead, it made his sister feel unheard. Anne accepts the words quietly. She does not need a grand gesture. She only needed him to recognize that her memory had been right. Camilla also sends a message. In a short handwritten note, delivered privately to Anne, she accepts that wearing the brooch caused pain, regardless of how the jewel reached her collection. The queen consort does not defend herself further. Anne reads the note once, folds it carefully, and keeps it. Charles makes the final decision. The brooch will not be worn by Anne, Camilla, Catherine, or anyone else for the foreseeable future. It will remain protected as Elizabeth's personal possession, ending the argument over who has the right to display it. Anne closes the velvet case with both hands. Charles places his hand briefly over hers. William steps back and gives them silence. The brooch is recovered. The record is corrected. The official who changed its status loses control over the collection. Camilla is cleared of deliberately altering the inventory while accepting that she should have questioned the jewel's history. Anne receives the acknowledgement she needed, and Charles finally protects his mother's wishes without compromise. What began as a dispute over possession ends as something far deeper. A monarchy built on inheritance is forced to remember that not everything valuable is meant to be passed around. Some things carry memory before they carry status. And when that small case finally disappears behind the secure doors of Elizabeth's private collection, Anne's tears no longer mark what the family lost. They mark the moment something precious was finally returned to where it belonged.
Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.